Okay. Just a moment. Hopefully. I tried to get done early, but I was like, oh, I've got a little time. Now I'll feed the dog and make, a liquid breakfast. Because as someone who gets migraines from chocolate, the chocolate instant breakfast is a good idea. Oh, wait. Okay, good. Oh. It's an amazing amount of stuff I have to go through to actually get to the courses. Goodness gracious. You'd think it'd be a little easier than this. Okay. So I'm going to close that down. Live streaming there. Just pull that up. Pull that there, pull that up. Alright. Now, pull this up. And, get that out of my way. Oh, Jesus. Okay. 823. I should check that out. Library. Yeah, that's within the first 1,000. Okay. Oh god, my back. My spine. Okay. So I'll give that a couple of minutes before we begin. See if anybody actually shows up. As usual, if there are any questions, just use the live chat there. And I will respond as best I can. First off, if you sent in your test, I did grade them. I'll get those up on Blackboard as soon as I'm able to today, which is to say, after class today, I didn't get some of yours, which is concerning. For the most part, let's see, for this class, they were pretty good. They were typically in line with like your grades from last time, I suppose. Well, I guess I shouldn't say that. Let me look at the other ones. I mean, I graded them like I grade the papers, which I have not put those grades out yet either. Grade them like I grade papers. And I mean, I printed them out because I grade things easier when they're printed out. Yeah, the issue that I ran into for the most part, I don't think it was as bad for this class. Yeah, because most of these grades were pretty good. But some people didn't. Here we go. No. Some people didn't take the whole like you need to actually put a little more effort into answering the question. Like these aren't the short answers that we had in the regular tests that we had in class. These are essay style questions, and while I said 2 to 3 paragraphs will be fine, you still need to give me some information. That's why these are take home tests. You need to let me give me a little bit of info to show that you actually did work. I don't think it was any in this class. I did have an incident of someone who just who just straight up copied like my notes, and also one that just like, yes, not this one, just like was obviously copying information offline. It wasn't answering the question at all. I'm like, hey, what's your favorite thing about the Industrial Revolution? It's like the Industrial Revolution was this, and this, and that was the whole answer. It's like that wasn't the question at all, and like it was good information that was given, but it wasn't it was not what I asked at all. So, just because it's a take home test doesn't mean you can just copy information offline and pass it off as your own. I mean, and even if it's not, like, I'm not going to go in and try to find some excuse to like, oh, I'm going to nail you down for plagiarism. But also, like, don't do that. It's not that difficult. I mean, there was one student, he did go a little bit overboard. Oh, that's an actual. Okay, these are the papers. I haven't gotten to the papers yet. Like, I mean, it was almost a paper in and of itself, like paragraphs for the stuff, and it was well written. So, I mean, I shouldn't say overboard because that would imply that they did something wrong. So, well done to this student. You'll know when I put the student, will know when I put go away when I put your grade up. So yeah. Point being, we did okay. Just FYI going forward, make sure you read the question and answer the question as I ask it. Don't just repeat it. Don't just, as my professors like to say, regurgitate a bunch of information. Don't just give me a bunch of word vomit. Also, something that was really common was whenever I talked about question 3, the thing about, hey, Napoleon did a lot of stuff that was good and bad. What was something good that he did? A lot of people was like, oh, he modernized Paris. Like, no, Napoleon the First did not modernize Paris. That's why there's an entirely separate question on Napoleon the Third modernizing Paris. Like, that's an entire separate question. If that's an entire separate question, then clearly that can't be the answer to another question. Like even if it wasn't Napoleon the Third, even if it was still Napoleon Bonaparte, because they're two separate people, if I'm using it as a separate question, that's probably not going to be the answer to another question. So anyway, we need to get into this stuff before I get too much further into the weeds. Because once we get on with this chapter, I've got to make this upcoming test into one of these and get it to you guys. So that's why I wanted to go ahead and get these done so I could talk about what we had and if there was any questions, and hopefully nobody's going to see this. Hopefully you guys can get some questions to me before I send it out. I wish you guys would show up for this class so you could ask questions. Alright, so we talked about the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire was falling apart. The various states were pulling off on their own. And as we mentioned, what was really the big issue were the Slavic inhabitants of Bosnia, which was under the control of Austria, all wanted their own state. And again, this is where the issue comes in with World War One. Is there's this pressure for nationalism where these people want their own state, but Austria's got control over it, and obviously Austria doesn't want to give it up, which in turn leads to the July Crisis. So, we're not going to go too much into what happened. Long story short, they were touring the area. Oops, whoa, now. Why we don't have all that up. The Austrians were touring the area. Archduke Ferdinand and his wife Sophie were there, and it was kind of a I mean, the Austrians knew it was dangerous, but it was sort of a power play of, oh, you're not going to mess with us because we're in charge. And turned out there was a plot to bomb his car, but I want to say either the bomb went off or the police managed to grab this guy, but it caused this big ruckus and blocked off a road. So the driver for the couple's car decided to take a detour because obviously the traffic's congested. And as they're going down this side road, Gavrila Princip, the guy who ends up assassinating Ferdinand, is just walking down the road, having heard through the grapevine, oh, the assassination attempt failed. So he's bummed out. He's like, well, so much for this. This was supposed to be our big day. And then he sees the car coming his way. He's like, well, I mean, I guess this is the only chance I've got. And he had a pistol on him, so he just pulls his pistol out and runs towards the car and starts shooting. So this happened at the end of June 1914. And the great powers all scrambled to either try to prevent the war or prepare for its inevitable eventuality. So, as I mentioned, the Austrians wanted to be assured that the Germans would back them up because they figured, something was going to happen. By July 7th, Kaiser Wilhelm II gave them a, quote, blank check, which is to say, hey, whatever you need, we'll back you up on. If, say, oh, wow, that might not even be a thing anymore. A blank check, which is to say, you just sign it and give it to somebody and they write in what they want. I don't know if that's a term anymore. So he accused the Serbian government of backing the assassination, which was partially true. Parts of the parts of the Serbian government were working with the assassination group, the Black Hand. And so they issued an ultimatum by July 23rd. So within a month, they had issued an ultimatum, and were given 2 days. And again, this was a time before social media or instant messaging or the internet. Basically all they had was analog telephone. 2 days to respond to what would basically be giving up Serbian sovereignty. It's, they would allow the Austrians to come in and conduct an investigation of their own with absolutely no kind of oversight from the Serbians. And if they found any kind of incriminating evidence, Serbia would basically forfeit its sovereignty to Austria. And they didn't want to let that happen. So there's the Archduke and Sophie. Now, I used to know what all the actual points of the ultimatum were, and Serbia agreed to all but like two, I believe. Again, for this class, it's not super important. But it wasn't enough for Austria. So Serbia began mobilizing on July 25th. Nicholas II of Russia, who... okay, the thing about Russia is Russia believed in this idea of pan-Slavic unity, and Serbia, well, really all of those small countries that had gotten their freedom were considered Slavic. They were a people that, weren't Germanic. They weren't Greek. They were people like the Russians. And so the Russians felt like they had a duty to protect them. So Nicholas II recalled his reservists to begin mobilizing. And again, it takes a long time to start mobilizing Russia. But also, once you start mobilizing Russia, you can't really stop. It's like I guess it's like a freight train. It takes a little while to start building up steam, start building up speed. But once it gets going, you can't really stop it. Or, I mean, you can stop it, but it takes like what's the thing? It takes a mile to stop a train. Once the train hits the brakes, it's gonna take a mile to actually slow down and stop. So Wilhelm II, of sort of made moves to try and get Russia to back down, but he didn't really take the idea of the war too seriously enough. And by July 28th, Austria declared war on Serbia. So the Germans were concerned about a true front war, sent most of their troops west to try and defeat France first, because they knew that France would immediately jump in with their ally Russia, because they were ready to help out and go to war with Germany. German Chancellor Theobald von Bethlenfalvig declared war on Russia on August 1st, issued an ultimatum to Belgium to maintain neutrality, because that whole thing. Whoops. Oh, yes. We'll talk about that in a minute. The Schlieffen Plan. The whole thing was to cross the border very quickly, get into France, and basically just pull another Franco-Prussian war. But that didn't really happen. How are we doing as far as... Okay, the quality's fine. And this should all be up on Blackboard. Well, Belgium told Germany, to fuck itself, because armed troops crossing a armed troops crossing a neutral nation are going to cause problems. I mean, even if they're not ransacking people's houses or stores or whatever, armed troops crossing through the countryside are still going to cause damage just by being there. So Belgium refused, called on Great Britain to honor the Treaty of London. So Great Britain declared war on the Central Powers, which was Germany, Austria-Hungary, and then joined the Entente, which was France and Russia. Technically, Britain didn't join the alliance per se. The Entente was still France and Russia. Britain joined as a separate party. It's weird, and it's, again, it doesn't matter, but it's Russia, or bleh, words. It's freaking it's Britain being Britain, and they didn't want to be like, oh well, we're allied with France. Like, nah, it's dumb, and just that's how the United States did. Blah, 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 in World War One. Once we joined in, we were like an independent party involved in it. So the Ottomans joined the Central Powers on the 31st of October. Bulgaria joined them as well in 1915. Italy joined the Entente in 1915. Greece in 1917. And then we joined in the spring of 1917. Right there towards the end of the war. And there again is something that I showed you guys before. That scrap of paper pushing for the enlistment in Britain. The Germans have broken their pledged word and devastated Belgium. Help keep your country's honor bright by restoring Belgium her liberty. Enlist today. One second. Okay. So, now obviously, the Europeans weren't unfamiliar with war, but the scale of this was beyond what they had seen before. Millions of men were being sent to the front. Millions of civilians had to take the jobs to support them, despite everyone being like, oh, well, this will all be over by Christmas. It started in July, August. It's like, oh, it'll be done by Christmas. Again, nationalism won out over class distinction. The socialists in Germany chose to fight and help fund the war, despite communists being like, oh, this is a capitalist proxy war. But, again, people's pride in their country won out over the idea of class solidarity. This is also a weird time in naming. St. Petersburg was renamed to Petrograd, since Berg sounded too German. Yeah. This is also when the royal family went from the House of Hanover to the House of Windsor, which is something completely made up because it's Windsor Castle there in Britain. So they're like, oh, we'll just be the House of Windsor rather than the House of Hanover because we can't be seen as Germans. We changed, here in America, we changed sauerkraut to freedom lettuce, which was stupid. We wouldn't say bratwurst. Just a bunch of stupid stuff. You know. Whatever. Can't be German. Yeah, the thing about World War One though, it got deep into French territory before it ground to a halt. I mean, you know, there's Paris right there. Hey, buddy. I mean, you can step on those. I'm not giving them back. I know. Um. So, despite all the conventions that I mentioned last time about, you know, not involving civilians, they were still caught up in the war. Now, for the most part, it was due to famine and such due to food shortages brought on by blockading. There were famines in Vienna. I distinctly read about. Speaking of which, there's my book. There we go. What you purring about, cat? Just gonna sit beside me. Yeah, machine guns, heavy artillery, used for the first time in Europe. Civilians were deported or simply killed by both sides. And the colonies themselves saw a lot of fighting, which isn't spoken much about. But of course, it happened. We had chlorine gas, Second Battle of Ypres, 1915, and unrestricted submarine warfare were seen as war crimes. Chlorine gas was led to mustard gas, and then unrestricted submarine warfare simply means if there's a boat, they will sink it, regardless of whether it's a military vessel or not, because there's the Lusitania, which like, oh no, there were like 15 Americans on board. We got to get involved. Because the Germans suspected that they were being used to smuggle weapons, because they were. And the holds of these ships, full of civilians, were military grade weapons. So you can't say that, it was, oh, the Germans are monsters, they're killing civilians. Okay, there's the artillery piece I was going to show you guys last time. But now here it is. Rapid firing, I think 70 millimeter shells. So, Western Front. Here we go, the Schlieffen Plan. So, the Germans' plan was to rush forward, capture France, just, get over with. Named the Schlieffen Plan. This was supposed to knock France out, so the German armed forces could concentrate on the Eastern Front, because, Russia. which again required the Germans to march across Belgium, which would cause an issue for Britain. And also, it required high mobility and being completely on the offensive, which at this time, technology favored the defenders, such as machine guns, because at the time, the machine guns were all the big, heavy, turret-based, tripod-based machine guns. There were no, say, assault rifles like you'd see, or submachine guns like you'd see in World War II. Everything. If it was something that a regular soldier or trooper could carry, it was a single shot rifle, semi-automatic, best case scenario. And usually, if it was semi-automatic, it was like a sidearm. So there's the boys in the trench. With all that mud. So the German offensive ground to a halt 30 miles outside of Paris. I mean, it's right there. At the first battle, the Marne, from September 6th to 14th, that was a long battle. So this was the point that trench warfare on the Western Front truly began. And while this slow, grinding warfare was terrible, it did allow Russia time to mobilize. And as we said, or as I said, trench warfare was bad. If you're not familiar with what that is, you had the two trenches where where my hands are. The two trenches where the soldiers were usually, a few hundred yards apart, and there would be an attempt from one side to go over the top and rush to the enemy's trench to take it. The problem was between your trench and the other trench would be large stretches of mud, barbed wire, craters from the artillery, and then the other side would usually have machine guns. And the most famous failed attempt at going over the top was the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Now, the Battle of the Somme, usually I would show you guys a video, but not only are we running out of time as far as the semester is concerned, we're not in class. So, Battle of the Somme, long story short, Britain decided to have an all-out push against the Germans. So they shipped in like tens of thousands of tons of artillery into a single location in on the line, which again, obviously at the Somme in France, and shelled the same part of the line of the German trench for a week straight. So, I mean, they just blasted the hell out of this line. And once they finished shelling it, they set off a landmine that they had put underneath the German line. They had managed to, I guess, dig underneath the entire no man's land and put a landmine underneath it. And it was just huge explosion of dirt everywhere. And then after that went off, they climbed over the top and began running across the field as much as you could run. I mean, it was more of a leisurely jog because, like I said, it was dirt and mud, and with all the artillery fire, it was so churned up you couldn't really get a foothold. Well, the German line, and also they had been told, oh yeah, the Germans will be long dead. You can just stroll on over there and just take the trench. Well, the German trench was more entrenched than they had been told, and as soon as they got close, they were all cut down with machine gun fire. And this was what I had alluded to before, in which this was all filmed by the British propaganda press, I guess, whatever they were called, and sent back to Britain as, oh, this is our good wartime boys doing their good wartime thing. But it shows them being killed. Like, it shows them rushing across this muddy field and falling as the Germans start opening fire. And, like, women were fainting in the theaters, and people were vomiting, and, like, they weren't ready for this. And then the British were like, oh, maybe we should be sending it back, completely uncensored reels of film. So, like, it was a whole thing, the Battle of the Somme. And that whole film, that's on YouTube right now. You can go see it, Battle of the Somme. And, as the propaganda piece that it was supposed to be. And it's again another really good look at what they, in the whole offensive. After they were cut down, it didn't end. It lasted for 4 months. The Allies gained 8 miles of land at most in the locations along the front varied. And cost about 600,000 lives on both sides of the field for 8 miles of land in a location that didn't really matter. Yeah, so there they are going over the top. The one leading there is an officer, specifically a nobleman. Again, that's why I say there's one good thing about World War One is the nobles all died. It I don't have a whole lot to say. I was going to say it wasn't a good war. There's no such thing as a good war. Now, over on the Eastern Front, Germany and Russia, Austria was there too, but, Austria. So the Germans wanted to expand into Russia and take land for their own. So they were more serious about just exterminating the civilians that were there, while the Russians fell back on their scorched earth policies, backing off and burning everything, made it really bad for the civilians that were caught in the middle. So there were some early German victories at Tannenberg and the Mossern Lakes, made commanders Paul von Hindenburg and Erich von Ludendorff heroes. We'll talk about them a little bit later. Obviously, Paul von Hindenburg, very famous. His namesake, used for a very large Zeppelin. February 1918, though, Russia fell, not to Germany, but to an inner conflict, the Communist Revolution. Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed. Germans pushed back west, while Russia lost much of its hard-won territory. We'll talk about that separately in a little bit. So, yeah, there we have the Eastern Front at the beginning of when the Germans started, and by the time of the treaty, this is where the Germans were. I mean, they had just rammed right into Russia. Now, of course, we can't talk about World War I and leave out Serbia. Now, despite the fact that Serbia was so much smaller than Austria, Bulgarian and German troops had to come in and help the Austrians by late 1915. The Ottoman Empire attempted to push against Russia and failed, so they came back and decided just to wipe out the Armenian people because, they were angry. However, they were successful in defensive tactics. They managed to keep the Allies, largely the Australians and New Zealanders, from taking the Dardanelles Straits to resupply Russia. There's a whole thing about the defense of the Dardanelles. However, the Ottoman Empire, which was already shaky, eventually did fall apart. The Arab armies sided with Britain, largely Lawrence of Arabia, against the Turks. It was a whole... Again, that could be a whole separate thing. There was so much going on in World War I that normally doesn't get talked about because it's not really spoken about in American history. It's like, oh, America was only involved in the last bit of it, so who cares? Yeah, so there's Bulgaria moving against Serbia, and then down in Albania. And the defense of the Dardanelles, Gallipoli as well, the mine straits there, and gun emplacements. I mean, it was not a good place to try and send ships, but it was the only place they could send ships, so... Now, in the colonies, there was also warfare that was fought in Africa. Civilian populaces were displaced. Colonial people got to see how civilized the Europeans were as they tore each other apart. again, in my paper on Zeppelins, I got to read about how the captain of one of the Zeppelins actually did a lot of supply runs down into Africa, and at night, because it would get so cold over the desert, um, the the Zeppelin would drop, because it uses gas. It would drop, and the bottom of the crew carriage would occasionally skim against the tops of the sand dunes. In East Asia, Japan was doing all right. It actually had allied with Britain to keep an eye on Britain's colonies, so that German aggression wouldn't mess with what Britain had while Britain was busy over in Europe. So Japan decided, hey, rather than just not doing anything, we'll take German colonial holdings for ourselves. And we'll also, while we're at it, sign a secret treaty with China and take some land in Manchuria, because, we're not just going to sit it out. So again, here is Africa as it was split up between the European powers. So most of what was happening between Germany and the everybody else would be down here: Germany, East Africa, Southwest Africa. I think they had Cameroon. I think Cameroon's African as well. Or German as well, not African. Duh. So here as well, but yeah. Unless that's independent. No, independent is Abyssinia. Okay, so, technologies. Who's a good boy? War leads to innovation, and the Great War, of course, had all sorts. Advanced gun, poison gas, as we talked about, the chlorine gas that led to mustard gas. And then, of course, artillery. Tanks and planes only really came to use near the end of the war, but would shape wars to come. Tanks and planes were in such a nascent, prototype, barely useful state towards the end of the war. But in World War II, they were the linchpins of the war. Planes and Zeppelins were mostly used for reconnaissance, but soon people started strapping bombs to them. Actually, at first, the planes, which again were basically, kites, would just fly over the enemy trenches and, observe the other side. And a lot of times there'd be planes from both sides flying over, and they would just kind of wave at each other because they're not armed. Until one idiot brought a revolver up there and they started shooting at each other. And before long, they had figured out how to strap guns to the front of them without shooting the propeller off. And then they eventually started putting bombs on them, and, it all went to hell from there. The navies didn't do a lot. The Battle of Jutland was a big battle between Britain and Germany, and it ended in a stalemate. Technically, the British Navy drove the German Navy off, but they didn't crush the German Navy, so the British saw it as a sort of a defeat because they weren't able to just completely destroy them, while the German Navy, despite being driven back to port and never leaving port again for that war, were like, yeah, we did really all right. That was pretty okay. Um, but of course, the use of the U-boats were a pretty big deal. Also, the Navy used the radio, which was very new at the time. Also shaped things to come. World War II was when we would get the radar, which was a big deal. I did a whole paper on the radar. What's my idiot cat doing now? Oh, that's where all my papers are. So here are some bigger artillery pieces. I mean, these were like in the process of firing all the dust that's coming up. I love these old dumb tanks. Um, these tanks were really bad. Um, they were slow. They didn't have a lot of power behind them. The armor wasn't good. Uh, the diesel engine inside them put off so much fumes that often the people inside would asphyxiate. Yeah, it was. These things were awful, but you know, you gotta start somewhere. Slightly better. I mean, they look tiny and adorable by comparison, but they uh they were better. God, I don't have no idea what these are called, but they're substantially better design. And there's the planes. These are actually flying in formation, so this is a later design. Then, of course, the big old battleships. This is probably the Battle of Jutland right here. Now, of course, there were still the old technologies being used in this war because this is still, I mean, yeah, it's 1914, 1918, but this is still around the turn of the century. We're still using technology from the 19th century. Um, so the telegraph, or its interception, was important. The Zimmerman Telegraph urged Mexico to join the Central Powers on the promise of receiving U.S. territory. Um, was finally the push that got the U.S. to join the Entente. Horses, a much older technology, technically, uh, were very important in the Great War, moving supplies, munitions, and wounded troops to and from the battlefield. We'll get to that in a moment. And actually, like, I don't remember what the number was. Let me see if I've got it here. Um, it doesn't have a number. Um, the the number of horses that died in this war were in the millions. Um, and like there are legitimate memorials to the horses who died in World War One. So there we have, the German uh, Empire carving off Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas for Mexico. California for Japan? Question mark. Which, like, I mean, Japan was allied with Britain at the time. I don't know what that's for. I mean, maybe this was done after World War II, and that was the mindset. I don't know. And the rest of it was like for myself. Anyway, there's some horse. There's a mule pulling a medical cart, and there's the I guess veterinarians um tending to the wounded horse. So that's neat. I really like this picture. It's a horse with a gas mask. So in the case of a gas attack, they could put that on the horse and don't have to worry about a horse absolutely freaking out. I mean, it's still going to burn his eyes, but it won't suffocate. You can only do so much. Also, there were lots of dogs on the front. And also spy pigeons. They were like homing pigeons, where they were trained to go in a certain path, and the camera would be set to take pictures every couple of minutes or whatever. I forgot I had that picture. Oh, also I love this one where the horse is just like hanging out. I love finding fun pictures. Meanwhile, on the home front, not the dirty, dangerous trenches, but the home front was part of the total war. Even when not in the middle of everything, like in Belgium, Serbia, Poland, and such, civilians all over Europe had to deal with rationing. Nearly every able-bodied male was pushed into the front lines. Women took up the slack and worked many factory jobs, often munitions. Now, munitions jobs were still dangerous. The chemicals that were used to make the bombs were very toxic, and a lot of the workers died due to this. Now, making munitions wasn't dangerous because, like, oh no, you drop the thing and it explodes, because that usually wasn't how they worked. But the chemicals were still dangerous and people would get sick. But, it was still a really demanding job. Now, once the war ended, though, it was like, oh, now women gotta go back to where women belong and all that bullshit. But, some did gain suffrage. The British were the first in 1918, at least in Europe. Like I said, New Zealand was like in the 1800s because New Zealand. So there's the women putting these shells together. Now let's begin on the Russian Revolution while we're here. As much of this done as we can. Sorry, got distracted. So, bu 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 bu. In Russia, industrialization came late. Wasn't complete by 1914. And while, everybody's like, yeah, motherland and we'll fight for Russia, everybody was patriotic and ready to go at the beginning of the war. People were very weary and angry very soon because the troops were poorly armed and supplied, so they quickly were killed or captured in droves. Nicholas II tried to lead from the front, left the government in the hands of his wife Alexandra, and the half-mad Rasputin. We'll talk about Rasputin in a minute. Rasputin was later drowned in the Neva River in December of 1916, but only after he was poisoned, shot, and beaten. So Rasputin was a monk who was definitely crazy, but he could help calm Nicholas's son, who had hemophilia, which is like it's a weakness, it's a disease, but like I'm trying to remember exactly what it is, but like it makes it so they bleed really easily. And essentially it's like they have really thin blood, but it also makes it so they faint very easily, that sort of thing. And anyway, Rasputin had a lot of pull in the family. So some nobles got together and decided, hey, let's have a dinner, Rasputin. And they gave him like a lot of poison. And he just, I don't remember if it was in his food or in his drink, but either way, he consumed a lot of poison and was just totally fine. So they shot him while he was sitting there. And he starts to get up. And they had these clubs and just beat the ever-living crap out of him. And, brought him to the Neva River. And this was in, like, January in Russia. And threw him into the river. They found his body later, and when he was examined, he had water in his lungs, which meant he was alive when they threw him in the river. So he actually died of drowning after all of that. So fucking Rasputin, man. Can you tell which one's Rasputin? There he is. He looks less insane there. Actually, yeah, he doesn't look too insane at all right there. All things considered. Hold on, let me see if that's like an important... Oh no, that's Gmail. It's not important at all. Oh, I'm live on my channel. Thank you, YouTube. Okay. So, February 18th, using the old Russian calendar, the Putilov munitions factory workers went on strike, and much of the city followed. Armed deserters began entering the city. By February 28th, revolutionaries seized railway stations. On March 2nd, Nicholas abdicated. His brothers... So March 2nd, Nicholas abdicated, but his brother immediately stepped down because he didn't want any of this, which ended a dynasty that had lasted 300 years. So the provisional government, led by the moderate socialist Alexander Kerensky, and if you know why I spelled it like that, you are a massive nerd. Shared power with the more radical Petrograd Soviet. So I mean, you can obviously tell from those signs what's going on. There's Kerensky. He actually looks like one of my professors just shaved. Well, actually, yeah, I had a professor that for the longest time had this goatee, and then he shaved, and it looked weird. But now he looks like Alexander Kerensky. Um, so as the Tsarist regime was collapsing, Germany began sending exiles home. Actually sending Vladimir Lenin straight to Petrograd aboard a sealed train in April 1917. Leon Trotsky, which was Lenin's partner in revolution, arrived the next month. So Lenin and Trotsky were the two big boys when it came to this revolution. Now, Bolshevik meant the party of the majority, but it wasn't the biggest party in Russia. But they were able to get recruits quickly with their slogan "Land, Peace, and Bread," which was appealing for the peasants, hungry workers, and war weary citizens. I mean, that's pretty appealing to, the common folk. I hope my pen doesn't bust. I'd be red ink everywhere. So let's see. There's Lenin there on the end. I don't remember what Trotsky looks like. He might not be in this picture, so I'm not even going to try to look for him. There's Lenin for sure. That's one of the famous pictures of him. In fact, it's right here in the book. It's on the sidebar that's talking about the Russian Revolution. Am I holding that up okay? Oh, good. The quality's dropped and shit all over itself. Thank you, YouTube, for doing that randomly. Actually, can I just bump that back up? Because that happens to me. Yeah, it's dropped down to 144p. For no reason. Oh yeah, I can bump that back up. Duh. Jeez. See, I'm dumb. Like, I do that whenever I'm watching other people's streams, then when mine goes down, I was like, oh no, my quality's down. Whatever will I do? I'm so stupid. Okay. We'll get to the October Revolution later. So the February Revolution actually got rid of the Tsar. And so far we have a moderate socialist group running Russia. But we'll get to when things really get crazy next time. And I'll try and get the test put together before Thursday, but no promises. If not, I'll put it together over the weekend and just post it up next Tuesday. And I'll give you guys a week on that. I'll give you guys extra time. And then we'll just try and tear through the last bit of stuff. When is the last day of class? Let me do that real quick before we finish. Oh my god. Oh The last day of spring classes end the 27th. So we have like a week and a half. Shit. Okay. Well, good. All right, I'll see you guys on Thursday. Um, y'all take care, and make sure anybody have any. Yeah. Okay. Did it freeze? No. Okay. Y'all take care, and I'll see y'all Thursday. Find my stream because I've got a bunch of crap going on. Okay. Yeah, and I'll get the the grades up for the test as soon as I can. I'm gonna try and grade the papers tonight and tomorrow and get that up too. Okay, bye.